I want you to pause for a second, because what happened in a federal courtroom just crossed a line American democracy has never crossed before. A judge didn't warn Donald Trump. She didn't negotiate. She didn't interpret his behavior generously. She caught him red-handed, violating a direct court order he had already agreed to follow. And then she said something no former president has ever been told in open court: do this again, and you may go to jail. This is not political theater. This is not a messaging war. This is a moment where judicial authority collided head-on with personal power, and neither side blinked. If you think this is just another Trump headline, you're missing the point. What happened here could reshape how the courts treat power itself. Stay with me, because what looks like a legal outburst is actually a systemic breaking point, and we are only at the beginning. And to understand why this moment matters so much, we need to step back and look at what the court was trying to prevent in the first place. At the center of this case is not Donald Trump's personality. It is not his politics. And it is not even the classified documents themselves. The real issue is control. Courts function on a simple premise. When a judge issues an order, that order must limit behavior outside the courtroom just as much as inside it. Without that power, trials collapse before they begin. Witnesses are intimidated. Evidence is tainted. Jurors are influenced long before they ever take an oath. That is why the judge issued a protective order early in this case. Not to silence speech, not to punish defiance, but to preserve the possibility of a fair trial. Trump agreed to that order. His lawyers acknowledged it in writing. The rules were not vague. They were precise. And yet, what unfolded next exposed a deeper problem, one that goes far beyond a single defendant. It revealed what happens when someone with a massive platform treats legal limits as optional. To understand why the judge reacted the way she did, we need to look at how this case reached this moment and why patience had already been stretched thin. I want you to understand how carefully this moment was constructed and how long the court tried to avoid exactly what just happened. This case had been building for months. From the beginning, the judge walked a narrow line. On one side was the reality of a former president with an unmatched public platform. On the other was the obligation to treat him like any other defendant under the law. That balance is why the protective order was written the way it was. Clear, specific, narrowly tailored. It prohibited identifying witnesses. It prohibited discussing sealed evidence. And it did so for a reason older than this case itself. Once a witness is exposed, fear replaces truth. Once sealed evidence is discussed publicly, the trial is compromised before it starts. For weeks, Trump tested the boundaries, not openly breaking the rules, but pressing against them. Posts that hovered just close enough to plausibility to force prosecutors to watch carefully. That history matters, because when December 10 arrived, this wasn't an accident. It was the culmination of a long pattern. And that pattern explains why the next moment didn't unfold quietly but explosively. December 10 is when the line didn't just blur, it vanished. Trump didn't hint. He didn't allude. He didn't stay in the gray. He named a confidential witness. He described classified materials that were under seal. And he did it publicly, on a platform with millions of followers. For prosecutors, this wasn't a judgment call. It was math. Screenshots, timestamps, posts that mapped perfectly onto the very language the court had forbidden. And here's the part people miss. This wasn't about embarrassment or decorum. It was about danger. Witnesses don't need to be threatened directly, to be silenced. They just need to know they've been exposed. When prosecutors brought those posts into court, they weren't arguing theory. They were arguing inevitability. That once the order was broken, this clearly the court had to respond or surrender its authority. If you're still thinking this was just Trump speaking his mind, pause, because what came next was not politics. It was enforcement. And when the judge pulled up the protective order in open court, the case stopped being abstract and became unavoidable. This is where the case stops being about Trump and becomes about the system itself. Courts do not rely on force. They rely on compliance. A judge cannot physically stop a defendant from posting. She cannot seize a phone in advance. She can only draw a boundary and enforce it when it's crossed. That is the hidden mechanism holding the entire justice system together. Orders work because violations carry consequences. When the judge displayed the protective order in court and read it line by line, she wasn't performing theater. She was doing something far more dangerous, eliminating ambiguity. Each prohibition was explicit. Each post was specific. Each violation aligned exactly with what had been forbidden. This is why the courtroom went silent. Once ambiguity disappears, discretion disappears with it. At that point, a judge has only two choices: enforce the order or admit it has no power. That is why the judge stopped Trump's attorney from interrupting. That is why she addressed Trump directly. And that is why her tone changed. The system had reached a point where patience no longer preserved fairness, it undermined it. And once that realization settled in the room, the second crisis began to form. When the judge turned to consequences, everything changed. This was no longer about explaining the rules. It was about enforcing them. She didn't speculate. She didn't soften the language. She made findings. The violations were intentional. They were clear. And they were contemptuous of the court's authority. Then came the number, $50,000 per violation. 5 posts, 250 zero total. That alone would have been extraordinary. But the courtroom understood immediately that the fine wasn't the point. The point was what followed. The judge said that any further violation would trigger custodial sanctions, not more warnings, not higher fines, custody. For the first time, a federal judge told a former president that continued defiance could result in jail. That statement does something irreversible. It collapses the illusion that status shields behavior. It tells every defendant watching that the rules are not negotiable. And it puts Trump in a position he has never occupied before, where the next move isn't rhetorical. It's physical. And once that line is drawn, it doesn't just affect the defendant. It reshapes the entire case and everyone connected to it. Now, I want you to imagine yourself inside this system, not as a spectator, but as someone affected by it. If you are a witness, this ruling is protection. It tells you the court is willing to act before harm becomes irreversible, that your safety is not an afterthought. If you are a juror, it's reassurance that the information shaping your judgment is coming from evidence, not social media pressure. And if you are a defendant without power or fame, it is something even more basic: recognition. Because for most people, violating a court order doesn't lead to warnings. It leads to handcuffs. That contrast matters. This moment forces a question that sits quietly beneath every high-profile trial. Are the rules real, or are they symbolic? For years, many Americans have watched powerful figures test boundaries and walk away untouched. That corrodes trust faster than any verdict ever could. This ruling pushes back against that erosion, not with speeches, with consequences. If this matters to you, if accountability matters, share this, because the strength of a legal system isn't measured by who it protects, but by who it restrains. And from here, the impact no longer stays inside the courtroom. What happened in that courtroom does not stay confined to American law. Around the world, courts are watching how power behaves when it is told no. Because judicial authority only works if it is seen to work, especially against the most powerful defendants. If a former president can ignore protective orders without consequence, that precedent travels. It tells other strongmen, other political figures, other elites that courts are obstacles, not limits. But this ruling sends the opposite signal. It says that platforms do not outrank process. That popularity does not dilute obligation, and that judicial authority is not optional, even for those who once held the highest office. This matters in fragile democracies where courts are already under pressure. It matters in systems where judges hesitate to confront political power. And it matters in the United States itself, where faith in institutions has been steadily eroding. The message is simple but profound. Rules still exist above individuals. And once that message is sent, it cannot be selectively withdrawn. Other judges can now point to it. Other courts can cite it. Which brings us to the most difficult question of all: what happens next? Because enforcement is not a single moment. It is a path. From here, the system splits into three possible paths, and none of them are comfortable. Scenario one, compliance. Trump stops. The posts end. The orders are followed. The trial proceeds under control. This is the cleanest outcome, and historically, the least likely, because it requires restraint, where instinct has always favored defiance. Scenario two, escalation without enforcement. Trump tests the line again. The court warns, but custody never comes. If that happens, the threat collapses into symbolism. And once that happens, authority doesn't just weaken in this case, it weakens everywhere. Courts survive on credibility. Once lost, it is almost impossible to restore. Scenario three, enforcement. Another violation, another finding, and custody follows. This is the scenario no institution wants, but every rule-based system must be willing to accept, because if the ultimate sanction is never used, then it isn't real. This is the paradox of power and law. The more powerful the defendant, the more dangerous selective enforcement becomes. The judge has drawn a line. Now the system must decide whether it means it. And that decision will define far more than one trial. This moment is not about a former president posting too much on social media. It is about whether rules still bind power when power refuses to be bound. For years, the pattern has been familiar. Warnings, finesse, defiance, and the quiet assumption that the ultimate consequence would never come. This ruling disrupts that pattern. A judge did not just punish behavior, she reasserted a principle that court orders are not suggestions, that compliance is not optional, and that status does not substitute for accountability. What happens next will tell us something uncomfortable but essential about American democracy. Not what it claims to value, but what it is willing to enforce. If the line holds, this becomes a turning point. If it doesn't, it becomes confirmation that some people live beyond consequence. That's why this isn't over. And that's why your attention matters. Watch what Trump does next. Watch what the court does after that. And if you want to understand how power, law, and accountability collide in moments like this, subscribe, share this, and stay with me, because the future of authority isn't decided in speeches. It's decided in moments like this.